Wake Forest dives into ACC play, and when they dive all the way deep. It's Clemson in week one of the ACC schedule for the Demon Deacons. It's been a rough go in this series. We will see what Wake Forest has for Clemson coming up in Death Valley. Actually, that game's at Wake Forest coming up on Saturday. We got Tony Syracuse on the line. Last word on college football. Hey, Tony.
Hey, how you doing, Mark?
I'm doing well. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
And let's get to this Liberty finish.
Sure.
Not a lot of people watch the game across the country, but when the score comes across the screen, a lot of people caught the dramatic finish, including myself. Liberty went for the gusto, went for the win. You know, an underdog on the road. Hey, let's pull this off right now.
Sure.
Pass broken up in the end zone. Otherwise, Wake Forest loses a game that they shouldn't. They escape 37-36. Just your conclusion on the performance, and as you mentioned to me before we started to record, maybe Dave Clawson dealing with the aftermath.
Yeah, I think escape is the right word. You know, there were players after the game in the post-game press conference who admitted that it was a lackluster week of practice. Now, leading up to that game, I had asked Clawson, is it possible this is the, to use that old media cliche, the trap game? You just came off an SEC win against Vanderbilt on the road, and you got Clemson. And he was certain the players would step up and they would be fine. And quite certainly they were not. There were players afterwards who admitted that it was a lackluster week of practice. They figured Liberty was a G5 team, and albeit a good G5 team, a good group of five team, one that they could handle and move on, and it proved not to be the case. Caden Salter, the quarterback, had a really good game against Wake Forest. And, the irony with that is that the week leading up to the game, his coach, Hugh Freeze, said watching the game film from the week before, which I believe was against UAB, I could be wrong, but the game film from the week before made him sick to his stomach. He said Salter runs too much. He's too quick to leave the pocket, and it makes me sick to my stomach to watch this. Look, Salter wound up with, well over 250 yards of total offense in that game against Wake Forest, and was really hard to contain. Wake Forest also had a lot of problems with penalties, which has been a recurring theme this season. They had another 7 penalties for about 70 yards. Holding penalties, just completely unnecessary holding penalties. Clawson would talk about there is such a thing as a good holding penalty. If you're about to, save your quarterback's head, go ahead and grab the guy and take him down. But these are, the play's already past you when you're reaching out and grabbing for a guy. Don't, they were drive killers. They really were. Wake Forest had 3 penalties on its first drive of the game. Defensive penalties, rather, on the first drive of the game. So it was sloppy. And the penalties continue to be a problem. Clawson has called them anything from disgusting to brutal over the first 3 weeks of the season. They're definitely going to have to clean that up. But part of what happened also with the, as you called it, the aftermath of the game, was there was not a lot of celebration with this win. It was a win. They're 3-0. Be happy. Clawson had to pull that happiness out of them. In the post-game press conferences, we had Clawson first, and then quarterback Sam Hartman came in, and there was not a smile to be had from Hartman. There was not a moment of, yes, I'm happy we won. He gave himself a D grade for his performance in the game. It was not a great performance. He was off. Some passes were overthrown. He had 2 interceptions, which were terrible throws, but it wasn't that horrible of a game. Still, he was unhappy, and he said, I know when I watch the game tape on Sunday, my grade is going to be the same because the tapes don't lie. When we talked to Clawson yesterday in his weekly press conference, he said he had to have a long talk with the team on Sunday after the film session saying, guys, you won. We're not going to hang our heads. We're not going to be that team that hangs our head after a win and feels bad about it. Because when you start to do that too much, the game's no longer fun. Let's remember, we won. Was it a clean game? No. Was it a perfect game? No. But he said, we also needed that kind of game to be challenged. They had blowouts against VMI and Vanderbilt in the first 2 weeks. We needed to be challenged in some capacity to see what we had within us before we opened up the conference play against Clemson. And he said, so we got it. Probably not the way we were looking for it, for it to come down to the last couple of minutes and having to stop Liberty on a 2-point conversion. Nonetheless, he said, let's enjoy the win and let's move on. And he really had to have a significant talk with his team on Sunday about learning to enjoy the win. He said in all of his years of coaching, he really has not had to do that too often. And he said, a win is a win. Let's take it. Let's learn from it. Let's move on.
Wake is a passing team, no doubt. Still, I'm going to bring up both the ineffectiveness of the ground game and also the lack of attempts in the ground game. So 3 carries by the team for -3 yards. I assume those are kneel downs at the end of the first half, I guess.
Correct.
So I'll even take that out because that hurts the average. It's 23 carries for 24 yards. If you take that out. And Hartman carried it 8 times. We know they like to do that mesh play where he kind of reads, keeps it in the belly of the back, and then he may take off with it after that. But, he led the team with 8 carries for 11 yards, and they just did not support. And this is against Liberty, facing arguably the best defensive front in college football Saturday night.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. They did not run the ball well. They did not run it. Cooley had a run for about 8-9 yards, which then got brought back by a holding penalty. What else is new? They didn't run the ball effectively, and so therefore they abandoned it later on in the game. They didn't. Clausen is not one of those coaches who is going to keep trying to force it, saying, darn it, we're going to keep running. We are going to impose our will and continue to run. Clausen is one of those coaches who says, if it's not working, forget it. We're going to move on to something else. He said yesterday, would I like to have more balance? Yes. But if they're going to stack 7-8 guys in the box to stop the run, then we're going to throw the ball. I have enough faith in Sam Hartman that he can get us the throws we need, knowing that he can play much better than he did last Saturday against Liberty, and that we can play effectively that way. So he wants the balance. He's not going to force the balance if the balance isn't working. He's not one of those coaches who's going to demand his offensive line, man up, get that push. If it's not working, turn the page on the playbook. He's very much an analytics coach. He's going to go by the numbers and the probabilities. He's not going to go by his gut instinct much at all. So if the numbers aren't in his favor, he's going to go to a different page in the playbook and find different numbers. And that's what happened Saturday. And you're right. Look, they're facing Saturday one of the best defensive fronts in all of college football. There's a good chance they're not going to be able to run the ball that effectively. Look, Clemson's missing Xavier Thomas, for another few weeks with his foot injury. Even with that, Clausen called all of these guys yesterday. He said they're all going to be playing on Sunday, when they're done at Clemson. He said, I can stand up here and talk about the front, the first 8 guys on the defensive line. They're that deep and that talented. That's how good they are. So he's got a lot of respect for the Clemson front line, as anyone who watches this game should. But I think he's also not going to say we're going to keep running the ball and see what happens. Quite the opposite. He said we're going to mix it up and find what's working and go with the hot play until they stop it, and then we'll figure something else out.
Tony Siracusa, last word on college football. Check out Tony's work right there. Again, last word on college football. So, Tony, you delivered to me before we started to record a stat that Clemson has outscored Wake Forest by 38.5 points per game, and that's covering how much?
The last 4 years.
Last 4 years. Okay. So here's my elementary level analysis of that number. Clemson's just flat out more talented, better.
Yes.
Okay. I'll take it even a step beyond that because that's obvious. Because that for 2 to 3 years of that was a Wake Forest bowl level team, 7-5 type team taking on one of the very elites of college football.
Mm-hmm.
Last year, we had a situation where Clemson hosted Wake. Wake ultimately wins the division. If you look at the rest of their schedule, they're struggling to score 20 points against the likes of BC and everybody. They're basically winning on defense, and they're winning one-score games against almost everybody in the ACC. They get to Wake, who ultimately goes to the championship game, and they have their most prolific offensive day of the season, score 48 points, and they make life miserable on Sam Hartman. My conclusion there is Wake, and we of course had the conversation with you when the news broke on Sam Hartman missing the early part of the season, was this guy may not be the best quarterback in college football, but he's certainly up there. But he may be the most valuable quarterback / player in college football, because so much rests on their passing game that this seems to be a bad matchup. Like Clemson what do you do to stop a passing game? Well, when you got one of the best defensive fronts in the country and you live in the opposing backfield, then it doesn't matter if you got Tom Brady. If he's on his back, he can't beat you. And that seems to be a bad matchup, because that's Wake Forest's game.
Yeah, you're right. Look, with regards to Hartman, and part of what we talked about when we learned he was going to miss, in to be determined amount of time, which wound up being all of one game, is that the thing that is most necessary for him back there is that he's got that it factor. He controls the huddle. He walks in, it's his team. Everybody on the team knows it. He will get after you, whether you're his roommate, his best friend, or an incoming freshman, if you're not doing your job. That having been said, you're right. If he's scrambling for his life the entire game, you got problems. The matchup of this game is going to be Clemson's defensive line against Wake Forest's offensive line. That is it. That is everything. Because as good as Hartman is, and he is good, and he can throw for 380 plus yards per game every game, but it's not going to matter if it's not in key situations. Look, last year in the first quarter, Wake Forest had 1 first down the entire first quarter last year in Death Valley. So they were already behind. And no matter how good Sam is, you're putting them behind the 8 ball, early on, and you're having to play catch up. And it makes your offense a little bit more predictable. So that's the matchup right there. It's not a good matchup, frankly, for Wake Forest, not right now, because you're getting the holding penalties and the brutal penalties as disgusting penalties, as Clausen called them. A lot of them are coming on the offensive line. You have got to maintain yourself in this game. You cannot beat yourself. Clemson doesn't beat themselves, right? Clemson only averages 38 yards in penalties per game. Now, granted, they haven't exactly played, a difficult or challenging schedule up front. Still, they're not going to beat themselves. They're a disciplined team. You have to be as disciplined, or even more so yourselves, to keep yourself in the game. And that is going to be incumbent upon that offensive line.
Tony Siracusa, last word on college football, breaking down Wake Forest side of the matchup with Clemson at Wake on Saturday night. So what we see out of the Wake defense against Liberty is obviously, 250 plus passing and, 4.5 yards per rushing attempt. It's not a great defense. They have their job. They have their role. How does that play out against Clemson? What does a good defensive performance look like?
It's not a great defense. It's a better defense than what it was a year ago or a year prior to that. They're not giving up as much in the run game. They gave up a lot to Salter, last week on sprint outs and things like that. But you're not going to see DJ Uiagalelei, running a lot of sprint outs for Clemson. He's not. It's not his game. And Uiagalelei, for all of the criticism he gets, and we've talked about this, the massive amount of criticism he gets from Clemson fans, he's having a much better year. He's already upped his completion percentage by like 9 points from last year through the first 3 games of this year. Again, they haven't played a difficult schedule, but nonetheless, the completion percentage is what it is. He's also dropped a good 35 pounds from what his playing weight was last year. When I talked to his dad, David, ACC Media Days, he briefly gave me a comment or two about how he'd gone through this off-season training program because he was playing quarterback at 260 pounds last year, which is absurd. What he is right now after weight training and things like that, who knows? But went into camp at about 230, 225, 230, somewhere in there. So he's a lot more fleet of foot. And Clausen was very impressed with what he saw in the first 3 games. Said he looks like he feels much more comfortable. He sets up in the pocket much better than he did last year. Doesn't get the nervous feet back there. But you can defend the traditional passing game a little bit more with Clemson than you could against a team like Liberty, who's got a dual threat quarterback, because that's just not DJ's game. It just isn't. Wake Forest is going to be down a defensive back. Brendan Harris is out for the foreseeable future with what was described as an upper body injury. It's part of the opaqueness that we deal with Wake Forest and injuries. His right arm was in a sling during the first half of the game last week. So he's out for a to be determined amount of time. It will be probably at least 6 weeks. But so from an improved defensive standpoint, and a defense that is doing a better job of getting pressure on the quarterback, Rondell Bothroyd, Kobe Turner, they're doing a better job up the middle and a little bit better on the edge. I think the defense can keep them in the game. Obviously, you've got Will Shipley, who is one of the best running backs in the conference. It's funny because Clausen called him the best running back in the conference, and kind of wonder what Sean Tucker at Syracuse, would think about that. But nonetheless, it's game day coach talk, game week coach talk.
Wait till they play Syracuse.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, I think Clemson's offense is, for lack of a better phrase, it's manageable. They're going to put up yards. They're going to put up points. It's about keeping their defense out of your offensive backfield. That's where the game is going to be determined.
Wake and Clemson, big game in the ACC. Both teams are 3-0, but this is the first conference game for Wake. Clemson at 1-0. Tony Siracusa will continue to break down this and other matters concerning Wake and college football and get his picks there. Last word on college football. Tony, we always appreciate you stopping by.
I'm always happy to do it for you, Mark.